You know what finally made me stop and pay attention? It wasn't a doctor's appointment or a number on a scale. It was a cheeseburger. I remember laughing to myself when that thought crossed my mind because, honestly, it sounded ridiculous. I was sitting at a little diner outside Bloomington, Indiana, a place I'd been stopping at for years whenever I drove down to visit my younger sister. Same booth near the window. Same waitress, Carol. Same order, too. Cheeseburger, fries, and a cup of coffee that was always a little stronger than it needed to be. I'd probably ordered that exact meal 50 times over the years. Carol set the plate down in front of me, smiled, and said, "The usual." And for some reason, I just stared at it. Not because anything was wrong with it. The burger looked fine. The fries smelled good. The coffee was hot. But there was no feeling. No anticipation. No hunger. Just a plate of food sitting in front of me, and me sitting in front of it. I picked up a fry and ate it mostly because that's what you're supposed to do when someone brings you lunch. I remember looking around the diner after a few minutes. There was a family with 2 little kids sharing pancakes. An older couple by the door was splitting a slice of pie. A man wearing a seed company cap was finishing what looked like a giant bowl of chili. Everybody else seemed to be enjoying their meal. I wasn't miserable. I wasn't sick. I wasn't upset. I just didn't care whether I ate or not. That bothered me more than I expected. Food had always been part of how I organized my day. Breakfast after feeding the dog. Lunch after finishing chores. Dinner while watching the local news. I wasn't someone who lived to eat, but I had always enjoyed it. Somewhere along the way, that enjoyment had become quieter. So quiet, in fact, that I hadn't really noticed it happening. On the drive home, I kept thinking about that half-eaten cheeseburger sitting on the table. I told myself maybe I was distracted. Maybe I had a bigger breakfast than I remembered. Maybe Carol had changed the seasoning. Funny how the mind works. We can come up with a dozen explanations for something unusual when the simpler possibility feels harder to sit with. A few days later, I opened my refrigerator, looked at everything inside, and closed the door without taking anything out. That was the moment that stayed with me. The next Saturday, I drove over to the East Side Community Center for the monthly woodworking club meeting. I had been going there for almost 8 years, ever since I stopped doing contract electrical work and found myself with too much quiet in the house. We were building birdhouses that month. Nothing fancy, just cedar boards, wood glue, and the usual arguments about whose measurements were off. Frank insisted on using a tape measure that looked older than I was. Pete brought homemade oatmeal cookies in a plastic container that had probably belonged to his wife 20 years ago. It was the kind of morning I had always enjoyed without really thinking about it. Around 11:30, someone mentioned lunch. Normally, that was the moment everybody started negotiating. Burgers at Charlie's. Soup and sandwiches at the church fundraiser. The barbecue place over on Route 46, if nobody minded the drive. I found myself nodding along while secretly hoping someone else would decide for me. That struck me as odd. Not alarming. Just odd. Food used to sound good before I ate it. I used to spend half the drive home from those meetings thinking about onion rings or a bowl of chili or whether I deserved a slice of pie afterward. That day, I honestly could not have cared less. We ended up at a small family restaurant near the highway. I ordered a turkey sandwich because it seemed easier than making a decision. The waitress asked if I wanted fries or coleslaw, and I remember pausing longer than necessary because neither sounded particularly appealing. I chose fries because I always chose fries. Habits can carry a person farther than enthusiasm sometimes. The strange part was that I enjoyed being there. I enjoyed listening to Frank complain about property taxes. I enjoyed hearing Pete talk about his granddaughter's soccer tournament. I drank 2 cups of coffee and laughed more than I had all week. Yet the sandwich sat in front of me, and every bite felt more like checking a box than satisfying a hunger. Driving back home, I tried to sort through what exactly felt different. I was not avoiding food. I was not trying to lose weight. I had not suddenly become one of those people who forget to eat because they are too busy. In fact, if anything, I had more free time than ever. A few years earlier, after Linda passed away, I promised myself I would keep living a regular life. I volunteered twice a month at the County History Museum. I still mowed my own lawn. I still met my brother-in-law every Thursday morning for coffee. I was not withdrawing from the world. Yet somewhere in the middle of all those routines, meals had quietly become less important than they used to be. A few days later, while waiting in line at the pharmacy to pick up allergy medication, I overheard two women about my age discussing restaurants they wanted to try during a bus trip to Nashville. One of them smiled and said, "Half the fun of traveling is figuring out where to eat." I smiled too because I knew exactly what she meant. Or at least I used to. Standing there under the fluorescent lights with a bottle of antihistamines in my hand, I suddenly realized I could not remember the last time I had looked forward to a meal. One Sunday afternoon, I drove over to my daughter Melissa's house in Columbus for my grandson Ethan's birthday barbecue. It was one of those late spring days in Indiana when everybody insists on eating outside, even if the weather has not quite made up its mind yet. My son-in-law, Greg, was standing by the grill wearing an apron that said Neighborhood Grill Champion, which had become something of a family joke because he had never actually won anything. Ethan and his friends were running through the backyard with water balloons. My granddaughter Sophie sat on the porch swing teaching her younger cousin a card game that seemed to involve more arguing than playing. It was loud, familiar, and comforting. The kind of afternoon that usually made me hungry before I even got out of the truck. Melissa handed me a paper plate and asked if I wanted a cheeseburger or a bratwurst. I surprised myself by saying, "Maybe later." She gave me a quick look, not a worried look exactly, just the sort of look daughters give their fathers when something sounds slightly out of character. I took a bottle of water and sat under the shade umbrella near the patio table. About an hour passed before I finally picked up a hamburger. I ate half of it while listening to Greg explain why college basketball had become impossible to predict. Oddly enough, I felt completely satisfied. Not full, just finished. There was a time when family gatherings revolved around food for me. I used to show up hungry on purpose. Thanksgiving dinners, church potlucks, 4th of July cookouts, Christmas breakfasts after opening presents with the grandchildren. Food was never just food. It was part of being together. Somewhere over the previous year or two, I had started approaching meals differently, though I could not have told you exactly when it began. I started eating smaller breakfasts because I simply did not feel like making much. Instead of eggs and toast, I might have coffee and half a banana. Lunch gradually became optional on days when I stayed busy. If I was volunteering at the County History Museum or working in the garage, I sometimes realized around 3 o'clock that I had not eaten since morning. That never felt concerning. If anything, I considered it convenient. Less cooking, less cleanup, less time thinking about what to make. I even joked with my brother-in-law one Thursday morning that getting older had at least one advantage. Grocery bills got cheaper. We both laughed because it sounded true. And honestly, I still enjoyed certain things. If somebody brought fresh peach pie to a church fundraiser, I would have a slice. If Melissa made her chicken and dumplings recipe, I would clean my plate. That was part of what made it difficult to notice. Nothing had disappeared completely. The changes were small enough that each one made sense on its own. One less snack, a smaller dinner, skipping lunch once in a while, choosing soup instead of a sandwich. Tiny adjustments spread over months. A person can adapt to almost anything if it happens slowly enough. Later that evening, after I got home and put away the leftovers Melissa had packed for me, I realized something that made me stop for a moment in the kitchen. I had gone nearly the entire day without ever actually feeling hungry. Summer arrived earlier than usual that year. By mid-June, I had already given up trying to keep the weeds out of the tomato beds behind the house. Every morning, I carried a folding chair out to the backyard with a glass of iced tea and told myself I would spend an hour pulling weeds. Most days, I spent 15 minutes pulling weeds and 45 minutes sitting there watching squirrels argue over birdseed. I was fine with that arrangement. One Tuesday morning, my neighbor Walter leaned over the fence and asked if I wanted to join him and a few others for the annual fishing trip at Lake Monroe. We had been making that trip for years. Nothing serious. Just 4 older men, a small aluminum boat, gas station coffee, and a lot of opinions about fish that rarely cooperated. I said yes immediately. Some things you do not think about. You just say yes because you always have. The morning of the trip, I stopped at the convenience store outside town. I bought a coffee, a breakfast sandwich, and a bag of peanuts for later. The cashier asked if I wanted the sandwich heated, and I remember hesitating because I suddenly realized I was not hungry at all. Still, I had already picked it up, so I said yes. The sandwich sat beside me in the truck for nearly 2 hours. By the time we launched the boat, the paper wrapper was cold and wrinkled. Walter noticed it sitting there and laughed. Saving that for dinner? I laughed too and told him I had eaten a big breakfast at home, which was not exactly true. I had half a piece of toast and 2 cups of coffee. The strange thing was that I did not feel like I was lying. In my mind, that had somehow become a normal breakfast. We spent most of the day drifting across the lake, talking about grandchildren, old jobs, and whether Indiana summers had actually gotten hotter or if we were just getting older. Around noon, Walter opened a cooler full of sandwiches his wife had packed. Turkey, ham, chips, cookies. Everybody ate except me. I had a bottle of water and said I would eat later. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? Missing one meal on a fishing trip does not exactly qualify as unusual behavior. The odd part came later that afternoon. We stopped at a small bait shop before heading home, and while Walter bought ice cream sandwiches for everybody, I suddenly remembered the breakfast sandwich still sitting untouched in my truck. I had forgotten about it completely. Not ignored it. Forgotten it. That stayed with me longer than I expected. During the drive home, I started replaying other moments. The frozen dinner I had thrown away because I forgot to heat it. The bowl of soup that sat on the kitchen counter until it went cold. The grocery list that kept getting shorter every month. None of those things had seemed important when they happened. Each one had its own explanation. Busy day, not feeling hungry, eating later. But somewhere between the bait shop and my driveway, I found myself wondering something I had never seriously considered before. What if these were not separate moments at all? Over the next few weeks, I started paying attention in a way I had not before. Not because I was frightened, more because I had run out of explanations. One afternoon, I volunteered at the Monroe County History Museum, where I usually spent Thursdays helping catalog donated photographs and old county records. It was quiet work, the kind I had grown to appreciate over the years. There is something comforting about handling pieces of other people's lives. Wedding photographs from 1948. Receipts from hardware stores that no longer exist. Handwritten letters from sons stationed overseas decades ago. Around 1 o'clock, one of the volunteers, a retired librarian named Susan, asked if I wanted to join her for lunch at the cafe across the street. I almost said no out of habit. Then I stopped myself. I told her yes, because I wanted to see if I would feel differently if someone else was there. We sat by the window. Susan ordered tomato soup and a grilled cheese sandwich. I ordered the daily special because I could not think of a reason not to. The food arrived. It smelled good. I remember noticing that specifically. The smell was pleasant. The presentation looked fine. I took a few bites while Susan told me about her son's new job in Arizona. After 10 minutes, I realized I had stopped eating again. Not intentionally. I had simply become more interested in the conversation than the meal itself. Driving home, I tried to remember whether I had always been that way. Maybe I had. Maybe food had never mattered as much to me as I thought. But that explanation did not sit right either. I remembered driving 40 miles for fried catfish with Linda after church on Sundays. I remembered arguing with my brother over who made the better chili. I remembered planning road trips around restaurants people recommended. Food had mattered. Quite a bit, actually. Another thing began happening around that time. Grocery shopping became strangely difficult. Not financially. Not physically. I simply could not think of what I wanted to buy. One Saturday morning, I walked into Kroger with a shopping list containing 6 items. Milk, bread, eggs, coffee, apples, soup. I walked every aisle anyway. I passed the bakery section, the deli counter, the frozen foods, the prepared meals. Nothing looked bad. Nothing looked good either. I spent almost 40 minutes in that store and left with a bag containing yogurt, crackers, and coffee filters. Halfway home, I realized I had forgotten the bread. Again. A few days later, Melissa called to ask if I wanted to come over for dinner the following weekend. Before she even finished asking, I heard myself say, maybe just dessert. There was a pause on the phone. Not a long one. Just long enough for both of us to notice it. You feeling okay, Dad? She asked. I laughed and said I was fine. Because I believed I was. Mostly. Yet after hanging up, I sat in the living room for a while without turning on the television. I started thinking about how many times recently I had chosen coffee over breakfast. How often I opened the refrigerator without taking anything out. How many meals had become something I remembered to do instead of something I wanted to do. It was no longer one missed lunch, or one forgotten sandwich, or one strange afternoon at a diner. The moments were beginning to line up beside each other, and for the first time, I was not entirely sure what they were trying to tell me. The moment that finally made me stop explaining things away happened on a Wednesday afternoon in August. Not at home, not at a doctor's office, not during some dramatic event. It happened at the county fair. I had been going to the Monroe County Fair for most of my life. Even after the kids grew up and moved out, I still made a point of spending at least one afternoon there every summer. I liked the livestock barns. I liked listening to local bands play songs that were already old when I was young. I liked seeing grandparents carrying oversized stuffed animals their grandchildren had won at carnival games. There was something reassuring about a place that changed so little over the years. That afternoon, I met Walter near the entrance gate. He had already eaten a corn dog and was carrying a paper cup of lemonade the size of a flower pot. We spent hours walking around. We looked at antique tractors. We watched part of a pie baking contest. We sat through half of a bluegrass performance because Walter claimed he knew one of the musicians, although I am still not convinced that was true. The whole time, I felt perfectly fine. Maybe a little tired from the heat, but no more than anyone else our age. Around 5 o'clock, Walter asked where I wanted to eat dinner. The fair had dozens of food stands. Pork tenderloin sandwiches, barbecue, funnel cakes, fried chicken, roasted corn. The smell of food seemed to come from every direction. I stood there longer than I should have, not because I could not decide, because I did not want any of it. I remember saying, "You go ahead. I think I am just going to get a bottle of water." Walter looked at me for a second, not with concern, more with curiosity. "You sure?" he asked. I nodded. He shrugged and walked toward the barbecue stand. I sat down on a bench near the exhibition hall and watched people carrying trays of food back and forth. Families, teenagers, older couples. Everyone looked hungry, or at least interested. I tried to remember the last time I had felt that feeling myself. Not the physical sensation of needing food. Something else. The anticipation. The pleasure. The simple expectation that eating was going to be enjoyable. And I could not remember. That realization sat with me in a way the others had not. I was not skipping meals because I was busy. I was not forgetting because I was distracted. I was not choosing smaller portions because I wanted to. Somewhere along the line, eating had quietly moved from something I looked forward to into something I felt obligated to do. On the drive home, I stopped at a gas station outside Bedford to buy a cup of coffee. The young man behind the counter asked if I wanted one of the fresh sandwiches from the warmer because they were running a special. Without thinking, I said, "No thanks. I am not much of an eater these days." I had never heard myself say those words before. The second they came out of my mouth, I realized I believed them. I sat in my truck for a few minutes before starting the engine. Not scared, not upset, just honest with myself in a way I had avoided for months. Whatever this was, it was no longer a collection of random moments. It was a pattern, and for the first time, I felt like it deserved my attention. The following Monday, I did something I had been putting off for weeks. I did not call a doctor. I was not ready for that conversation yet. Instead, I drove to the public library. Not because I thought I was seriously ill. I just wanted to understand whether what I was experiencing was something other people my age dealt with. There is a certain comfort in learning that you are not the first person to notice a change in yourself. I found a few books about healthy aging and sat near the back window overlooking the parking lot. I remember feeling slightly foolish. 74 years old, and sitting in a library trying to figure out why I no longer cared much about lunch. But the more I read, the more I realized something that had never occurred to me before. Hunger is not as simple as we think it is. When we are younger, we tend to believe appetite comes from the stomach. You get hungry, you eat, problem solved. But as we get older, appetite turns out to be connected to all kinds of things. Taste, smell, energy levels, daily routines, social connections. Even the way our bodies process signals throughout the day. I thought about that for a long time. Because when I was younger, hunger felt obvious. I worked construction jobs in my 20s. Later, as an electrician, I spent entire days climbing ladders, carrying equipment, driving from site to site. By noon, I did not wonder whether I wanted lunch. I knew. My body told me. Somewhere between then and now, those signals had become quieter. Not gone, just quieter. One example in a book caught my attention. It compared appetite changes in older adults to hearing loss that happens gradually over many years. Most people do not wake up one morning unable to hear. Instead, sounds slowly become softer until one day they realize they have been asking people to repeat themselves for months. Reading that made me sit back in my chair for a moment. Because that was exactly what this felt like. I had not suddenly stopped enjoying food. The enjoyment had slowly become harder to hear. Another thing began making sense. Over the past few years, my daily life had changed in ways I had never connected to eating. After Linda died, I cooked less often because cooking for one person felt different. Volunteering kept me busy, but sometimes busy in a way that distracted me from regular meals. I drank more coffee than I used to. I ate at odd hours. None of those choices seemed important individually. Together, they created a new normal without me ever noticing it happening. I also learned that as people age, they sometimes experience less intense signals related to hunger and thirst. That surprised me more than anything else. Not because it sounded frightening, because it sounded familiar. I thought about all the afternoons I had skipped lunch because I simply never felt hungry enough to stop what I was doing. I thought about standing in grocery store aisles unable to decide what sounded good. I thought about sitting at family dinners feeling happy to be there, but strangely uninterested in what was on my plate. For the first time in months, I stopped asking myself, what is wrong with me? And started asking a different question. What if my body has simply been trying to tell me something in a quieter voice than it used to? Walking back to my truck that afternoon, I did not feel scared. I did not feel relieved either. Mostly, I felt something I had not felt since this whole thing started. I felt like I was finally beginning to understand what I had been experiencing. The next step I took was smaller than I expected. I did not schedule a battery of tests or completely change my diet overnight. Honestly, I was not even sure what needed changing. What I did know was that waiting for hunger to show up on its own was no longer working very well. So I decided to experiment with something simple. I started treating meals the same way I treated other parts of my day that mattered. Not as feelings, as routines. On Monday morning, I wrote 3 reminders on a yellow legal pad and taped it to the refrigerator. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. Nothing more complicated than that. No calorie counting. No special foods. No grand plan. Just 3 moments during the day when I would stop and ask myself a question I had stopped asking. Have I actually eaten? It felt strange at first. There is something humbling about needing to remind yourself to do something that once happened automatically. But then I thought about all the other things I already did that way. I did not wait until I felt like paying bills. I did not wait until I felt like changing the oil in my truck. Some parts of life work better when you rely on habits instead of feelings. Around that same time, I made another small adjustment. Instead of eating alone every chance I got, I started saying yes more often when people invited me somewhere. One Thursday morning, I met my brother-in-law for coffee as usual. Except this time, when he ordered breakfast, I ordered breakfast too. Not because I was hungry, because I realized that eating had once been connected to people as much as appetite. We sat there for nearly an hour talking about absolutely nothing important. College football predictions. Whether gasoline prices would ever make sense again. The weather forecast. I finished almost everything on my plate without thinking much about it. A few days later, I attended a church fundraiser pancake breakfast that I probably would have skipped a month earlier. I found myself sitting with 3 people I barely knew, listening to stories about grandchildren, retirement plans, and fishing trips that had gone terribly wrong. Somewhere in the middle of that conversation, I noticed something interesting. Food tasted better when I stopped evaluating whether I wanted it. It was not dramatic. It was not some magical return of appetite. It was simply easier. I also began keeping foods around the house that required almost no effort. Yogurt, peanut butter, bananas, soup, crackers, cheese. Nothing expensive. Nothing complicated. I stopped expecting every meal to feel satisfying in the way it once had. That adjustment turned out to matter more than I expected. Because once I stopped chasing the appetite I remembered having at 40 or 50 years old, I became more willing to work with the appetite I actually had at 74. Over the next several weeks, I noticed small changes. Not every day, not even every week, but occasionally, I would realize that I had thought about lunch before noon, or that a bowl of soup sounded genuinely appealing on a rainy afternoon, or that I had finished dinner without reminding myself to do it. More than anything, I stopped feeling like my body was betraying me. That may have been the biggest change of all. I began to understand that getting older had not erased the signals my body was sending. It had simply changed the volume. And once I stopped waiting for those signals to sound the way they used to, I found that they had been there all along. By the time October arrived, I found myself back on the same stretch of highway outside Bloomington where this whole thing had first caught my attention. Melissa had asked if I could stop by on my way home from visiting my sister, and afterward, without really planning to, I pulled into that same little diner where Carol still worked the afternoon shift. She recognized me immediately. The usual? She asked with a smile. I smiled back and said, you know what? I think so. As I slid into the booth by the window, I realized something that surprised me. I was actually looking forward to eating. Not because I was starving. Not because I had forced myself to follow a routine. Just because, for the first time in a long while, the idea of sitting down for a meal felt pleasant again. The cheeseburger arrived. The fries looked exactly the same as they had months earlier. The coffee was still stronger than it needed to be. Nothing about the restaurant had changed. The only thing that had changed was me. Or maybe that is not quite right. Maybe I had simply started paying attention to myself differently. That thought stayed with me while I ate. I did not finish every fry. I did not suddenly rediscover the appetite I had at 30 or 40 or even 60 years old. But I enjoyed the meal, and that turned out to matter more than I expected. One of the strange things about getting older is that we spend so much time preparing ourselves for the big changes that we sometimes overlook the quiet ones. We expect gray hair. We expect sore joints. We expect to move a little slower. But we do not always expect our relationship with ordinary parts of life to change. We do not expect hunger to feel different. We do not expect food to become less exciting. We do not expect our bodies to whisper instead of speak. Sitting there in that diner, I thought about all the moments I had spent trying to decide whether something was wrong with me. The forgotten lunches. The untouched sandwiches. The grocery store aisles where nothing looked appealing. The family dinners where I enjoyed the company more than the food. None of those moments had been dramatic. None of them had been emergencies. They were simply small pieces of information that I had not known how to understand yet. I also thought about Linda. She used to tell me that growing older was not about fighting change. It was about learning how to notice it without letting it frighten you. I did not fully understand what she meant when she said that. I think I do now. Because the truth is, I did not solve anything by becoming worried. I helped myself by becoming curious, by paying attention, by accepting that my body at 74 was not supposed to behave exactly like my body at 44, and by recognizing that needing to adjust does not mean failing. It means living. Before I left, Carol came by to refill my coffee. She looked at my plate and laughed. Looks like you got your appetite back. I laughed too because I was not sure that was exactly true. What I had found was something a little different. I had found respect for the quieter version of myself. The one who needed reminders. The one who needed routines. The one who needed patience. Driving home that evening, watching the autumn lights settle over the fields, I realized that aging had not taken something away from me. It had simply asked me to listen more carefully. And sometimes, that may be one of the most important lessons of growing older. Our bodies do not stop speaking to us. They just begin speaking more softly.